Hi guys. Before we proceed to this video, we've got something very important to share with you. Neoliberalism, Inequality and Authoritarianism by Professor John V. Kofis is available for purchase. You can order it directly from the publisher Little French eBooks or through Amazon.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an analytical session on the institutional crisis in the United States. This is part three, the last part of a three-part series. The first part dealt specifically with the unexpected election in the primary of New York City of the progressive candidate Zoran Mamdani, and the reaction, rather extreme on both the part of the establishment Democrats as well as the Republicans. The institutional crisis in that particular election manifested itself insofar as really the mainstream media, mainstream analysts, mainstream politicians did not expect New Yorkers, let alone the specific demographic group, namely white middle class New Yorkers, to vote for a progressive candidate, self described democratic socialist, who is really a neoliberal, I'm sorry, a New Deal Democrat, who is adamantly against neoliberalism, as well as containment militarism and military adventures, including regime change operations, which are very costly for the United States. Now, that was part one. Part two dealt with the criminal justice system. The institutional crisis is manifested in the criminal justice system in everything from the restructuring of the Department of Justice geared to serve political goals and serve the unitary executive theory that the Trump administration has been promoting, namely a very strong presidency, executive branch of government, to the detriment and weakening of the other two branches, namely the judiciary and the legislative branch, although the Supreme Court of the United States, dominated by GOP appointed justices, has actually embraced unitary executive theory, and that is an inherent part, an integral part of the institutional crisis of America, which has resulted in the undermining of democracy, the erosion of democracy, and the slippery slope toward authoritarianism. This part three of the last part, in fact, of the institutional crisis deals with foreign policy. There are various theories, and there are a lot of books and articles on this issue. There have been since the end of the Cold War in 1990 and the pronouncement by the United States, George Herbert Walker Bush, that there is a new world order. Cold War is over. The old Cold War was over. And the new world order was a unipolar world structure under the rule of law that as the United States deemed it should be, by the way. That too seems to be withering away, considering that that United States foreign policy was built on stages, as we'll see, to retain Pax Americana, and really the old world order, the old Cold War, the early Cold War, in other words, and containment militarism, or military Keynesian, based on military Keynesian policies, that is, putting the surplus of the government in and the economy into defense sector and using defense as leverage for geoeconomic advantage on a world scale. That really took off. It did not subside as there was a promise of the so-called peace dividend back in the 1990s. On the contrary, that was only on a temporary basis. And then we see skyrocketing defense budgets to the degree that the United States not only got involved in two very costly wars, depending on whose statistics you believe, of course, and except from Brown University to official government statistics, anywhere from $5 to $7.5 trillion for the occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan for 2 decades under different presidents. The combination of the neoliberal, as we'll see, and I'll get more analytical into this, of the bankruptcy of the neoliberal system, the neoliberal political economy, combined with the bankruptcy of containment militarism, which is old, early Cold War policy, really going back to the Truman administration. That combination is at the root of the institutional crisis in American foreign policy. Now, there are various theories, as I said at the outset, and I do want to give an overview of some of those, certainly not all, some of those. One theory, and it's a universal theory that's used not only for the United States, but historians like me especially like to use this one, and books on the history of foreign affairs, of whether it's the foreign policy of China or Japan or any country, England and so forth. And going back to the Roman Empire, they have used this. The first theory is that there is a natural course in any imperial power, like the United States, which is an imperial power, has been, to undergo stages of developing, rising, ascendancy, if you will, in its status regionally and globally. Then there is the maturity phase of it, and then there is the decline. And the decline, of course, the rise, maturity, and decline, all of it packaged under the label, many people know it as Pax Americana, the Latin term meaning American peace, taken from the term Pax Romana, the old Roman Empire terminology, if you will. So the United States was at the zenith of its power during the presidency of Truman Harry Truman in the late 1940s, who succeeded FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, and of course Dwight Eisenhower in the 1950s. When we get into Kennedy with a combination of Vietnam and the Cuban Missile Crisis, we begin to see problems, although economically the United States had shown cracks in its global economic hegemony, as the IMF secretly warned Dwight Eisenhower during his second term that the balance of payments deficit, which was chronic, was becoming a problem because the dollar as a reserve currency did not reflect the amount of gold the U.S. had in its reserves in the Federal Reserve banks. So what you have is a problem really that starts in the late Eisenhower, the second Eisenhower term, and it really slowly unfolds. Now, one other theory, this is the first theory, the natural course of things, rise, maturity, decline. Another theory about why there are institutional crises in imperial regimes is that the rise of East Asia, specifically China, unexpected, and in fact, to the degree unexpected, because the United States plan from the Kissinger-Nixon trips to China, to Beijing during the Mao period, all the way to the era of China opening its the floodgates by the late 80s, early 90s to its economy and integrating into the world economy, the West, with the United States leading the West, simply assumed that China would become what it was in the late 19th, early 20th century, when it was divided into spheres of influence by the Western imperialist powers, Japan and Russia, also in there, by the way, and it would become sort of a periphery serving the core of the capitalist world system. Never did they imagine that China would become the core and not serve as the periphery of the transatlantic core led by the United States, namely the G7, Japan included in this group, by the way. So this is another crack, another delusion, which, of course, they couldn't possibly imagine. They thought the world was at their fingertips at the time in the 1990s. There was no longer a Soviet Union. China was integrating. It would play right into the hands of the transatlantic core with the US leading it. That's not how things worked out, as we will see. This is another cause of the institutional crisis in foreign affairs, because China is regarded by many in the West and some Eastern countries as well as the country that challenges the G7 and specifically the United States for global hegemony. The third theory about the institutional crisis is that there is an arrogance of power based on the doctrine of American exceptionalism, 19th century theory. Well, which, you can throw in there manifest destiny and the idea that the people of this land, the Europeans, Northwest Europeans, who were the elites of the United States, the young republic, were destined to become like the mother country, as William Appleman Williams wrote in his outstanding book during the late stages of the Vietnam War, a book entitled "Empire as a Way of Life." Well, there is an arrogance of power, but that arrogance of power has really led, regrettably, a lot of analysts, politicians, billionaires who are funding politicians, the two main political parties, to simply assume that somehow foreign affairs is not dynamic. It's not ever changing, and it doesn't respond to the realities of the empirical world out there. We have 8 billion people on this planet. US is 350 million. We have other countries that have emerged, that have risen from 1945, when the US experienced the zenith of its power, to 2025 today, when the US is running around imposing tariffs and, of course, using containment militarism and the vast power that it has in its defense sector to muscle its way to retain the power of Pax Americana of the 1950s, although this is a delusion, because the rest of the world has moved on. The United States is not today what it was in the 1950s. The fourth theory on why there is an institutional crisis is that the assumptions made by the mainstream American intelligentsia, the mainstream political parties, the two, Democrats and Republicans, the mainstream media, mainstream think tanks, the billionaires, Wall Street's billionaires, and the institutional structure that they control, all of them assumed that the end of history theory, in other words, that we don't have an enemy, a challenger anymore, considering the Soviet Union, the Soviet bloc rather, collapsed, the entire Soviet bloc, and that the West would integrate it economically and militarily. After all, to this day, the goal of NATO is to expand into Eurasia. That's why we have a Ukrainian war. One reason, not the only one, but one reason, to expand into Eurasia and Asia and use that geopolitical power for geoeconomic advantages in Eurasia and Asia to contain China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. Okay, that's um, that's part of the dream of the 1990s, that somehow the unipolar world order that George Herbert Walker Bush announced is here to stay would be forever. When in fact, today, China-led BRICS group, which Russia, of course, is included in there, is challenging that order, and it keeps telling the West that the reality out there on this planet is that there is a multipolar world order in reality. However, in the vision of policymakers, analysts, the media, politicians in Washington, again, both parties, is that no, we can really, we can bring back Pax Americana of the 1950s. After all, the end of history, 1990s theory, nonsense theory, of course. We can bring that back. Now, the my own theme, and I'm not the only one who embraces this. There are many works on this issue. They all authors, scholars have different approaches to it. Is that the crisis, the institutional crisis in American foreign policy, is really rooted in the crisis, in the combination of the crisis of the neoliberal political economy as manifested especially during the Great Recession of 2008, and China, of all countries, helped to bail out the world economy, the United States included, by the way. Here's China, the archenemy for as far as many in the West are concerned, combined with the policy of massive spending on defense and containment militarism, as though the world hasn't changed since the Truman administration, since 1950, when National Security Council document 68, NSC 68 as it's called, on containment, is applicable in 2025, as though the world didn't change. So this is part of the ideological, mind-boggling puzzle here. How could thinking people, rational people, responsible for giving advice on policy, and we'll see there are those who give advice, those who are give a lot of money and they feel that entitles them to determine policy, and they prevail, by the way. And then policymakers themselves. How could they fool themselves? Or is it the fact that, well, they have the money, you know, we have to follow their advice? But it is mythology to assume that the model of the 1950s, of the Eisenhower, the early 1950s, of the Eisenhower, of the Truman, sorry, the Truman and Eisenhower era, can somehow be transported in the mid 2020s, in the 21st century, and somehow the world, the rest of the world hasn't changed, the US hasn't changed, nothing's changed, everything's the same, as though the US is able, and Trump, of course, is using different tactics than Biden. He's using, as we'll see, coercive foreign policy with regard to tariffs, as though this is sustainable, as though this will stop a country like China and the BRICS group from moving forward, as everyone from the IMF, the World Bank, Goldman Sachs, independent organizations have argued, these countries will move rapidly ahead as the 21st century unfolds, leaving the US behind and its G7 partners. It's already ahead in GDP terms, by the way. In any case, let me point out that the foreign policy of any country from ancient times to the present is a reflection of its social contract and its domestic policies. The domestic policies of a country, the foreign policy of a country is a reflection of its domestic policy. So if the domestic policy is reflected in the social contract, is designed to strengthen capital, the elites in society, foreign policy is designed to do the exact same thing through diplomacy and military means. Okay? So foreign policy is an extension of domestic policy. Foreign policy reflects the social contract. If the social contract is intended to strengthen the elites, big capital, Wall Street, then that's what the foreign policy will try to achieve. Although the means, let me be very clear, the means of getting there may be very different for the Cold War neoliberal Democrats than it would be for the GOP, for the Republicans who are now neo-isolationists under Trump. Although there's a mixture of neo-isolationism and interventionism on their part, by the way, as they have evolved in the second Trump administration. The United States established very firm foundation for Pax Americana and for essentially managing the world system, the capitalist world system, even before the war ended. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system, which created the two sister banks, as they're called, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, those two institutions were designed based in Washington, D.C., by the way, and the U.S. as a member contributing the largest percentage because it had the largest GDP of all the members. So it essentially controlled those two institutions. Through those two institutions, the U.S. would manage the world economy and use those institutions to essentially serve the integration of the world economy under the aegis of the United States to benefit Wall Street. Okay? So when we look specifically at what the IMF austerity measures were doing and what World Bank development loans were doing, whether in Indonesia, in Turkey, in Argentina, in Chile, the goals were the same, regardless of what administration was in office, Democrats or Republicans. That was the way the US managed the world economy. At the same time, during the 1940s, the US established the general agreements, the agreement on tariffs and trade. In 1947, that same year, the Truman administration, the president promulgated the Truman Doctrine, essentially arguing that Greece, Turkey, and Iran, if you look at a map, by the way, they form sort of a continuous geographic area. It's like an umbrella to protect the oil of the Middle East countries, which was, of course, which would be flowing west, and it was flowing west. At that time, Iran was pro-West under the Shah. So that doctrine essentially redefined national security of the United States. Up until that time, the Monroe Doctrine prevailed, which was essentially that the U.S. would be hegemonic in the Western Hemisphere from Canada all the way down to Argentina. 1947, wherever the U.S. had global interests, the national security interest of the United States extended to the entire Western world, as it was called back then, East and West, communism versus capitalism. And it used containment militarism, considering that up until 1945, the US had monopoly on the bomb, on nuclear weapons. After 1949, not 1947, sorry. In 1949, two very important developments. The Kremlin announced under Joseph Stalin that it had tested the bomb successfully, and the U.S. immediately went into panic mode and ordered the development of the hydrogen bomb, and then from the atomic to the hydrogen. And then the other thing that happened that same year is that Mao Zedong prevailed over Chiang Kai-shek, the nationalist who retreated in the island of Taiwan that became separate and independent. So there was this ominous picture in 1949, the Soviet Union with obviously the Eastern Europe being under the Soviet orbit of influence, and then China, the Mao Zedong prevailing, China becoming communist, with two major satellites, namely North Vietnam and North Korea. So the U.S., the way it looked at all of this is from a monolithic perspective, that all of this, of course, was revised lately. Henry Kissinger, who was obviously intelligent, not for in the good sense, but very intelligent individual, by the way, very astute individual, especially compared with, by the way, the foreign secretaries, secretaries of state, I guess, in the U.S., the secretaries of state that really come from Reagan afterwards and thereafter until today. Henry Kissinger was very intelligent, not for the good of humanity, by the way, but very intelligent. And he understood that the communist bloc was a myth. It was no such thing as communism. Each country, nationalism, in other words, transcended communism. Let me put it very bluntly. And the idea of treating it as a bloc was actually to the detriment of the West itself. This is one of the delusions that they held, just like they hold today other delusions. And they realized, Kissinger realized this. This is why he hence the opening in China. He realized that in the course of the Vietnam War, he realized, you know what, China and the Soviet Union don't have that much in common. They're not necessarily the best of allies. And in the course of the Vietnam War in negotiations, of course, with Le Duc Tho in Vietnam, he recognized all of this. Again, another delusion, long-held early Cold War delusion. Nevertheless, the combination of the Bretton Woods system and containment militarism under the military Keynesian system model prevailed. However, it was very expensive. It was very expensive. It really cost the United States a lot. And the IMF warned about this. It warned in secret because this is very sensitive. It would have created turmoil in currency markets, in stock markets, in all over the world, especially the U.S. I think it was 1957, 58, somewhere in there. And in the second term of his presidency, they warned him that things are not well. If this continues, this trend of chronic current account deficits, this is not going to go well for the credibility of the dollar. The dollar is really not reflecting its actual value. It's inflated, but transacted as though there is the goal to back this. And of course, eventually the U.S. under Nixon 71 went to the fluctuating currency. In other words, the dollar as backing the gold backing the dollar ended. That was the end of the gold standard. Now the United States enjoyed a long sustained hegemony of the Western world and conveniently used communism to do so, by the way. This is not to say that communist China under Mao or Stalinist Russia were the panacea, not at all. It's just that the West used that as an excuse, and they used the West, by the way, respectively, that is the Kremlin and Beijing, used as the West conveniently to rally support among their allies. The US used the other side to mobilize support uh, among the Western allies. Right? Look at the communist menace in China. Do you want that? As well as at home for domestic policies to create a docile labor force, especially and middle class, to engender conformity, sociopolitical conformity on the part of the masses, and the media was, of course, serving the state. All of that worked very well. And then, of course, in the 1980s, the unfolding of the Soviet bloc during the Gorbachev era, Mikhail Gorbachev began to ask a lot of questions of things are not going very well. And they were not. He was right. And at the same time that China was in transition, let's keep in mind that China was watching Russia and Russia was watching China. Okay. A lot of people don't take this into account, that it wasn't just the US, uh, that is Reagan with Gorbachev, but actually the Chinese were watching what was going on with regard to the Russia-American relationship in the 1980s. They were watching to see where is all this headed, what would be the role of the state, what kind of a society would unfold in Russia as it was undertaking rapid reforms, glasnost and perestroika in Russian, the openness society and the reform of society. Uh, that is the decade, 1980s, of the neoliberal political economy, when we have deregulation of the marketplace to the detriment of the working class and the middle class. We have the replacement of the social welfare system and Keynesian economics with neoliberal economics, that is corporate welfare. The state is there to transfer capital from the mass taxpayer, the working class and the middle class, to Wall Street, to the richest 1%, but let's extend it to 5%. That's about it. To the point that today that 1% owns more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans. Okay? That crisis in the domestic institutional structure of the economy has reverberations in foreign affairs. One reason is the policy of military Keynesianism, pouring money into the defense sector, money that they didn't have, they don't have, and they didn't have, meant a budget that showed chronic deficit. So that meant that the percent of debt, public debt to GDP, was rising rapidly, very rapidly, to the degree that today it's out of control. It's close to $37 trillion, by the way. It is astonishing that a country with around 28 trillion GDP, nominal value, it could be 29 million for 2025, is having a debt at 37 trillion, public debt at 37 trillion, because the interest has to be paid on that debt. That is, the bonds have interest, and the government, that is the taxpayer, pays interest on that. And when you put the combination of the interest on that debt, okay, that huge tax cuts under the neoliberal system to the rich, to the degree that when they were paying in the mid 70s during the Eisenhower administration, the wealthy and the corporations, they're now paying under 20%, if that, because of the tax loopholes, by the way. When you take that into account, there is a crisis in the political economy. And it's created because of this combination of out of control spending for defense and payments for the public debt interest, because they had to borrow the money to give back this latest bill that the Trump administration and the GOP, the congressional dominated the GOP, which dominates both the House and the Senate, passed 4.5 trillion. That money has to be borrowed. They don't have that money to give back to the rich who don't need it. It has to be borrowed. That means more, a greater burden on the taxpayer, the general taxpayer, to pay interest on that debt. Greater burden on the taxpayer to pay for the nearly 1 trillion defense budget. No country spends that in the world. The US spends more than the 10 or 11 countries combined behind it. Okay, this is at the core of the institutional crisis of American foreign policy, because the defense sector is part of that. Defense is an extension of diplomacy, to follow the analyst Clausewitz argument about what the role of defense is. It's an extension of diplomacy. And in this case, what we have is indeed a crisis, because the US opts for military solutions, for regime change operations, for proxy wars like the one in Ukraine. Very expensive wars in Iraq and Afghanistan to the tune 5 to 7 trillion. All of this goes on the debt because the money isn't there. When you combine it with the fact that when you look at what, I'm not comparing it with a Democratic administration, but a Republican one. General Eisenhower, war hero, by the way, World War II. The 1950s tax rate for the rich and corporations, combine that with what Trump has imposed and the tax givebacks, okay, not to mention corporate subsidies and bailouts, by the way. When you put all that together, it is going to have a holistic effect on the entire national economy, and that impacts foreign policy. It is not surprising that Trump imposed tariffs, because tariffs were designed in congressional testimony. Democrats, of course, kept pressing Trump administration cabinet officials to explain to the American people who exactly pays the tariffs. They refuse to admit that it's the American consumer. They refuse it. It is a way, when you lower the taxes on the billionaires, multimillionaires, and corporations, somebody has to pay higher taxes. Plus, you got to cut programs like Medicaid and school lunch programs, right? And because you're raising the defense budget, right? So someone has to pay the bills. This is why we come to a foreign economic policy which defies the Bretton Woods system. It defies the WTO, which replaced GATT, by the way, the World Trade Organization. It defies the rule of law in international relations. It adopts neo-isolationist economic nationalism policies, imposes tariffs not just on the so-called declared enemies, let's say Russia and China, but the entire world. Neighbors like Canada and Mexico, Brazil, everybody. Europe. The question is, let's take Europe, the latest deal that the Trump administration made, imposing 15% tariff. It went up from 5 to 15. Okay. Those who follow the exchange rate have seen in the last couple of days what has happened. The euro, the currency that the European Union uses, by the way, the euro immediately weakened. Okay. On that news. Why did the euro weaken? Because the Trump administration dealt a blow to the European economy. American consumers are going to pay this, but European corporations, European businesses exporting to the United States are going to hurt because they're going to take a hit. There is going to be less of their products sold because guess what happens back in the United States? What happens is that these tariffs compel the consumer, the American consumer, to buy American. You might argue, fine, good and fine, let American jobs grow. It's not American jobs, it's American profits that grow, not the jobs. American profits grow because what happens in the United States is that the companies competing with the exporters who are now charged 15% surcharge, that is a tariff, selling to the US market, what happens to them is that the American companies competing with them is they can afford to raise their prices. So the American consumer winds up paying more. And if they want to buy that European product, they're going to pay the charge. So this is indeed detrimental to the economy of Europe. And there is something to be said, and the Truman administration, about having strong trade partners, by the way. The Truman administration immediately recognized this because the U.S., I didn't mention this, but I should. During the Truman Doctrine, the U.S. was also preparing at the time, Secretary of State George Marshall was preparing the so-called Marshall Plan, essentially to provide some aid, stimulus, to stimulate European economic development so that the United States can have a strong trading partner. Because unless it did, it would lapse into a recession. In fact, it started to lapse slowly toward the recession. So on the surface, these tariffs may appear, especially when you read some of the pro-Trump press, media analysis. This is great. Make America great again. Actually, it makes America weaker. Not great. Let's wait and see who pays the bills. There have been studies analyzing on the impact, and it's not in the interest of the American working class. There are marginal benefits, but the overall economy will suffer, and intermediate and longer term, as well as short term, as well also. What will happen is that the U.S., in weakening its trading partner in Europe, forces European companies to look elsewhere. And where else do they look at? They look at Asia. And in Asia, who is the big dog? Who is the country that the world is afraid of is becoming the new hegemon? China. So you see, this is part of the inadvertent shooting oneself in the foot by following short-term policies, trying to justify neoliberal tax cuts for the very wealthy who don't need it, by the way, again, while causing residual damage, causing damage to all sorts of sectors from a state structure that's weakening. Okay, it weakens the revenue, it lowers the revenue that the state takes in, raises the public debt, and then borrows more, so it burdens the American taxpayer with a greater bill to pay interest on that debt, while they raise defense and use defense as leverage to basically coerce countries to deal with the United States, because the military is really the only leverage the U.S. has now. And then it weaponized the dollar. It has weaponized, and this is both Democrats and Republicans. It has weaponized trade, and it's universal. It's not just, oh, as I said, I want to stress this, because Canada is not an enemy. If Canada is an enemy, okay, it's an enemy. Mexico is not an enemy. Brazil is not an enemy. It has declared the world as the enemy. Why? Because it competes with the United States. So what is going on here? The U.S. under Trump expects Europe, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Latin America, Mexico, as well as Canada to the north, to essentially subsidize the U.S. back to a healthy Pax Americana. That's what's going on. This is what's going on with regard to this tariff policy. And then when you combine it with Trump's demands that not just NATO raise defense spending from 3% to 5% of GDP, and demands that they buy weapons. By the way, uh, part of this deal that was just recently made between Trump and the European Union is that the Europeans buy American weapons, that they invest in the American economy. All of it is non-binding, by the way. We'll see. This is why some of the Democrat senators and House members came out and said, this is a lot of myth. This is rhetoric, because this is not binding. They don't have to do anything. It's up to the companies. The state simply facilitates. So you might argue, well, the Europeans were slick in this regard. Yes, they were, because they argued, by the way, this is how the market economy works. We're not going to impose. We're not China to guide corporations. This is what you must do. We're European neoliberals. We are going to allow companies, if they want to invest 650 billion in the U.S. economy, buy U.S. aircraft and buy U.S. weapons, that's up to them. So however, there will be some purchases, because some of those purchases are carried out by the state, by the way, like defense. Okay, so the idea here is to force them to buy more, to strengthen the continued weakening of the U.S. economy. So this is how foreign policy is used now, and the tariffs the same thing, to serve these multidimensional purposes. The question is this sustainable, and is it going to work? Considering that there is an option for the entire world. It's the China-led BRICS group, and everybody knows it, because China is the world's #1 trading partner. Okay, it's that simple. And China has the muscle, it has the leverage, especially with regard to rare earth minerals, which are used for high tech and defense, to do a lot of things that the US cannot do. Also, China has the world's largest economy in purchasing power parity. I have said this in many, many sessions, and I repeat it. It's the world's largest economy. Look up the International Monetary Fund webpage, World Bank, Goldman Sachs, anyone. Look up what is the world's largest economy in purchasing power parity. You'll see that it's China, by trillions, by the way, ahead of the United States. And purchasing power parity is the only thing that matters, because the paper has no intrinsic value. It's what it buys. Now, I want to turn to something that is very important, discussed a lot in the United States, especially not so much by the right-wing press and the conservative press, but by the independent, especially independent press, namely the Project 2025, which is basically funded by 6 billionaire families. who want to impose their vision of U.S. domestic and foreign policy on America. And they have, although Trump, before he became president, had argued, well, he was going to distance himself from this. The fact is that the people working for Trump came from Project 2025. The vision of these billionaires and the think tanks that they fund is that American society, through domestic and foreign policy, can become the great Pax Americana it was under Dwight Eisenhower. That's delusion number one. Again, they are stuck because they are billionaires. I suppose being a billionaire affords someone the ability to be more delusional than the average person because they have money. And they figure, well, if I got all this money, if I'm a billionaire, and there aren't many, very many of those in the world, I have to be. That means that I can bend society to my liking. I can create a society as I would like to. Well, they envisioned the Project 2025 envisions a world in foreign affairs with certain assumptions. First of all, they installed in the Trump administration, throughout the cabinet and advisors, ideologues who share their far right-wing vision of domestic and foreign policy, including tariff policy, economic nationalism, and punitive measures toward China. These people are against a world that looks at foreign policy, fomenting peace, spreading peace to the world, and basically used to uh, ameliorate crisis, lessen the crisis, and solve them through diplomatic channels, and to pursue humanitarian missions. One of the reasons USAID dismantled is this. They look at foreign policy from a militarist perspective. They look at foreign policy from a perspective of um, an America that is preeminent, and it is, by the way. They don't have the most nuclear warheads in the world. Russia has those, but they spend more on defense than any other country in the world. China is second, by the way, just for the record. China is second, but it's way down. It spends 1/3 of what the US spends. Although China is 1.5 billion people, US 350 million, right? And China, in purchasing power parity, has the world's largest economy. It can afford to spend more, but it doesn't. It tries to hold defense spending to the level where it can contain the US, because the US has been destabilizing China through the Taiwan Strait, using Taiwan, and in the South China Sea. So they actually have been forced to spend a lot more on defense in the last 3-4 years. Actually, it started long before this guy, Trump. But they have been spending more. And the reason is that it is in response of the threats on the Taiwan issue and South China Sea. Now, the Project 2025 group is also pro-Israel, pro-Zionist state, and anti-Iran. It does not have a favorable view of the Palestinians and Palestinian sovereignty. It believes that, and this ties in with the recent deal that Trump struck with Europe, that Europe must go back to its role of the early Cold War, when it played second fiddle to the United States, namely serve a subservient role to buttress the American economy and American national security. Okay, just go along as a junior partner. And of course, it has a hostile view of China. China is the archenemy. And these are billionaire families. They should know that China, and if they don't, I'm sure they do, that China really is unstoppable in terms of global economic integration. China has, in fact, integrated much of the world economy under its aegis. Not, it doesn't go to Africa, as African leaders have told the United States, by the way, the US government repeatedly, from Biden to the present. You come to the continent, you go country by country, and what you offer are military bases. And on occasion, you want exclusive rights to mineral extraction or oil extraction. That's it. China goes in and offers infrastructural development, which includes schools and hospitals, roads, bridges, right? It offers multi-level economic development and sustained. This doesn't mean that China, by the way, is some humanitarian country. China is there to do business, and China, by the way, does not have a good labor record in Africa, nor does it have a good record in paying some of the local producers. Let me make this clear. I don't want to paint China as some saint. It isn't. It's there to do business. This is only a relative comparison. When we compare, this is what the Africans themselves are saying to the United States. It's a relative comparison. When you compare what they offer, the package they have on the table, and what the U.S. offers, their package, the package on the table, that is multi-level economic development, that includes infrastructure development, social development, economic development, and sustained trade for the long term, looks much better than the U.S. One-dimensional focus. Let's put a military base here. Just for the record, by the way, the U.S. has a military presence in most countries in the world. I think 170, 175 countries. There are only 195 countries. The U.S. has military and some form of military presence in almost all of them, in 175 countries. This is costly, by the way. This is costly. And it's used as a substitute for what China is doing, which is economic integration, global integration, and going in and offering this multi-level package of economic development. That's another foreign economic policy, another model of the foreign economic policy that the U.S. has consistently, repeatedly refused to offer. Instead, they go into Afghanistan for 20 years and to Iraq for another 20 years. And what do? They use the military to do what? To determine the regional balance of power. And ultimately, they fail because the only beneficiaries from those two military occupations were Iran, geopolitically. Iran was strengthened by that, not weakened, by the way, contrary to U.S. delusional goals, foreign policy goals at the time, that somehow they were going to weaken Iran, because that's what Israel wanted, by the way. They were pushing for this. Weaken Iran, weaken Iran. Iran was strengthened. The world saw what happened recently when Iran hit Israel. It saw that Iran is not Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, Syria, or Iraq. Iran is very different. It has the military muscle with deep roots in both Russia and China to fight back. So the question, of course, on the crisis and the institutional crisis of U.S. foreign policy is, what are the root causes of the crisis? The policy itself, because the policy itself is based on delusional thinking that somehow the elites, by the way, have this, and people like these six billionaires behind Project 2025, that somehow they can bring back the America of the 1950s. And by the way, they promote Christian nationalism. They are against migrants in America, although migrants enrich the American economy. Illegal migrants, yes, it's illegal. It's against the law. They come undocumented. Some of them have been there more than 20 years, but that's still illegal. They came in, they didn't establish citizenship. This takes place in other countries. The question is this the way to handle it? Is a war on the migrants, which, by the way, is really sending a signal to the working class of America that this is how we deal with, because we're talking about work. What are migrants but workers? It's an attack on labor. This is class warfare on the marginalized population of the United States. Now, the global challenges to Pax Americana, according to Project 2025, is indeed multidimensional, but China is at the core. Can the US really do anything about China? Considering that China and Russia have a strategic relationship and an economic relationship that binds them together, and the one country that pushed these together more than anyone else, it has been the United States. Kissinger tried to do the opposite when he went to Beijing at the end of the Vietnam War, realizing, you know what, let's take them apart. Trump has tried a sort of a very weak and very thoughtless, I should say, version of that, to separate Russia from China. Is that that's possible? That's not possible, because the reality is, and that's why I call it thoughtless, because the reality is Russia is a Eurasian country. It's in two continents. It's a Eurasian country. It has a deep strategic relationship with China. It has a deep interdependent economic relationship with China. It's not going to break away from China. And China has made it very clear to the United States and NATO, by the way, that it will not accept a military defeat of Russia in Ukraine. Now, since I mentioned Ukraine, the forever war doctrine that we became used to under Biden, actually everyone was thinking around the world, not just in the United States. That would be over when Trump takes power. Why? Because Trump himself said, I can end that war in a day. This is the last day of July. Today is the last day of July. Trump took over January 20th. More than a day has passed, and that war seems to have no end. So the forever war doctrine seems to be applicable under Trump. So much for the rapprochement that he was going to bring about. And that war for the United States is costly to the degree that Trump had the Europeans pay the United States to send aid to Ukraine. Is that sustainable? That can be cut off at any time, by the way. The Europeans have pressures from their own population, because Israel, in New York City, the past few days, there has been a conference about recognizing Palestine, the state of Palestine. And Israel and the United States are the only countries isolated from this global conference. Israel, the last 2 years, almost the last 2 years, has carried out a war that even Israeli organizations, former Israeli government officials, some independent media in Israel agree is a war of war crimes, genocide. There's no doubt about this. Israeli human rights organizations, let alone what the ICC, the International Criminal Court, has decided, have argued that this is genocide. What is happening with the mass starvation of women, children, adults in Gaza, that's a war crime. The US refuses to accept that. And it refuses to accept that Palestinians exist. and that they have rights as citizens in this world, somewhere in some corner. The Israeli response, arrogantly, to which the US keeps silent, is if you want them, take them. You want them in Paris, Macron, take them in Paris. Um, you want them New Zealand, take them. You want them Spain, take them. Anybody wants them, you can take them. We don't want them. That's the response. The Palestinians who welcomed the European Jews, mostly Eastern European Jews, in the 1940s, the mid 1940s, when no one in the world, including the US, wanted them. They welcomed them. The Palestinians welcomed them to the Palestinian Mandate, as it was called back then. They, of course, went to unconventional war and created the State of Israel by 1948. And since then, an apartheid state like South Africa, by the way, which ended in 1990 under Nelson Mandela, and intermittent wars and destabilization, and the US all along behind Israel. I want to say a few concluding words about the future of the of U.S. foreign of the institutional crisis of and U.S. foreign policy. It is rather ironic and tragic that the United States wants to weaken itself. I'm sorry, strengthen itself at the expense of weakening not only its rivals, not only its perceived enemies, declared enemies, but also its allies, namely NATO allies. It is rather ironic that it is imposing such terms on them that ipso facto they become weaker. One thing that has come out of the New York Conference on Palestine is that they are breaking away on this crucial, they're not breaking away on the Ukraine issue, regrettably, but they are on Israel. And they have said enough is enough. The genocide must stop. The humanitarian crisis must end. The future of the crisis, which stems from the social contract in America, namely the elites determining foreign policy. Project 2025, 6 billionaire families behind the foreign policy of the Trump administration. It is not a secret who determines U.S. foreign policy. It is not some farmer in Idaho. It is not a hotel cleaning woman, whether migrant or not. It is not a steel worker in Pennsylvania. It is the billionaires who have visions of an America that they want to create. And that America is of the past. Under Christian nationalism, no less, supporting, of course, Zionism in Israel. The convergence, by the way, is very interesting that there are Christian Zionists as well as Jewish Zionists, and there is convergence there because there is convergence in their economic interests. There is no quick fix as we have seen, in repairing the crisis in U.S. foreign policy. As we have seen, no quick fix in Ukraine, no quick fix in Israel, because the entrenched interests are very much wedded to the policy of containment militarism and neoliberalism. That is the prescription of self-destruction, in my view. Not just in my view, a lot of analysts, by the way, including governments, that is, China is in that group, believe the same thing. That this is not a constructive way to pursue foreign affairs. The United States is arguing, continuing to argue, that it is a country promoting democracy and the open society and human rights. The record shows that that's not the case. The United States is not a member of three very important United Nations sub-agencies. It is not a member of the International Criminal Court. In fact, it has imposed sanctions on some of its judges. And yet it demands that the International Criminal Court cater to U.S. Expectations when it comes selectively, of course, when it comes to to what the U.S. deems as worthy war criminals like those in the Kremlin, but not those in Tel Aviv. Okay, the United States has defied international law. The idea of a world order based on the rule of law is really laughable because there is no rule of law. There is a competition for hegemony. And the competition for hegemony is aiming to weaken China through containment, militarism, and through economic nationalist coercive policies through tariffs and sanctions. How sustainable these policies are is questionable. Do these policies make the American economy stronger? Do they result in a stronger middle class and a stronger working class? And you can't have a society with a strong middle class, which is required, by the way. It's a prerequisite if you're going to have a democracy, unless you also have a strong middle working class. When there is class warfare under the neoliberal model, and there is a weakening of the working class, the middle class is weakening. That's why another manifestation of this institutional crisis, other than foreign affairs, was in the New York City election. And the middle class of New York voted for someone who is anti-establishment. He's a progressive Democrat, so-called socialist Democrat. Okay, so the question, of course, is whether this foreign policy is serving democracy or it's serving some version of authoritarianism at home, which, by the way, more and more conservative billionaires funding GOP candidates have, in so many ways with their actions stated, would best serve their interests. There are others, to be fair about this and balanced, there are others who are very skeptical that this is the correct way to proceed with the social contract in America. I want to thank you for tuning in, for listening. Please write questions, ask questions rather, write comments, and by all means, join this channel. It's an educational channel. Thank you very much.